And as you might be able to tell from my lack of Louisiana accent, I'm not Braden Jenkins. So, funny story. I got up at 6 this morning, and as most men do, he requires much less time than I do to get ready for church. So at 8 o'clock, I go to wake him up, and he says, "I'm sick." I said, "No, you're not. You got to teach this morning." He said, "No, really, I'm sick." And I said, "Well, I guess I helped you write your notes last night. Maybe I can teach them." He said, "Okay." I said, "No, really, stop me. I don't think I need to." He's like, "No, I think you can do it." I was like, "Okay." So here we are today. So before we get started, let's just go to Lord in prayer. I know we've got a lot of needs in here. Let's pray for our services this morning, all of the classes that are going on, our worship service that we're going to have here in a few minutes. So if you'll stand with me, and let's bring all of our needs to the Lord. Lord, we thank you, God, for letting us be here this morning. We thank you that you've given us this opportunity to come together and worship you, to dig into your word, Lord, and to make your praises known. Lord, I pray for each and every need represented in this house. God, I pray for all the financial needs, spiritual, physical, emotional, Lord. I pray that you touch each and every person in this place. I pray that we would have an ear to hear, Lord, what your Spirit has to say to the church today. Lord, let us be worshipers in spirit and truth. And let all the glory and all the honor be to you, Lord. I pray for everybody that's sick, everybody has a need. Thank you, Jesus, Lord. We love you, we adore you. Thank you, Jesus. All right, thank y'all. Y'all may be seated. So, funny enough, I know the last time Braden taught, he started off by telling y'all that it was my lesson that I'd come up with. Well, it's the exact opposite this morning. I might have helped write the notes, but this is all him. So I'm going to do my best to deliver it the way he intended. So his title for this morning is "The Table is Set." So last time, he kind of started off saying that he loved cooking. It was his first love. And it really is. When we got married, I thought I was pretty okay at cooking. I watched The Pioneer Woman quite a bit. Knew a few recipes, had kind of toyed around in the kitchen with a few cookbooks. And then Braden comes into my life, and he throws all the cookbooks and recipes out the window and says, "Just measure with your heart. It's just something you got to know how to do." So in our house, I'm very fortunate to say he does most of the cooking, and he's very good at it. So I'm completely okay with him being the main cook in our household. It's something that's, for him, really rooted in tradition. His grandmother taught him how to cook. They're not really Cajun per se, but they're very influenced by that culture. All of his recipes can be traced back, to grandparents and great-grandparents, and that's what his family does. When they get together, they love to cook. Our family, on the other hand, whenever we've got something we want to celebrate, we don't cook, we go out to eat. We pick a good restaurant. We let somebody else do all the work. So it's definitely been a little bit of a cultural shift in the past 2.5 years for us. But, cooking actually does serve a lot of really important functions in our life. First and foremost, we have to eat to live. Without cooking and preparing food, we're depending largely on overpriced takeout or processed foods that aren't really the most nutritious for us. So in order to lead a healthy lifestyle, in order to get the nutrition we need, the sustenance we need, we have to cook to live. But food also connects people. Braden's his grandmother, his Mall Jen, was an excellent example of that. I heard stories of her while she was around. Unfortunately, she passed away right before we got married. But she was one of these types. Her husband would find somebody walking along the side of the road needing a ride, and he'd say, "Well, why don't you come home for supper?" And she would always have a table set. They had 6 kids, but she always cooked enough for at least a dozen, because they would just bring people in. If you needed a meal, if you needed somewhere to stay, that was all found around the Jenkins table. So she was an excellent example of how food connects people. And even studies show this. There's actually an initiative called I think it's called the American Supper or Dinner Initiative, and it reports that only 30% of families today eat meals regularly together. We lead such busy lifestyles that so many of our meals come from fast food drive-through windows, or even if something is cooked at home, we're just eating in shifts. Somebody eats in the living room while somebody else is on the computer doing work, or somebody's taking kids to practice while some of the family eats. It's very rare to find families that regularly sit down and eat all together for most of the time. And like I said, it's just the nature of the beast. with this new culture. Everybody's so busy. Everybody's got a schedule to keep. But in spite of that, there are so many benefits of eating together as a family on a regular basis. And this is true for both kids and the adults of the family. For kids, studies have shown that kids that eat meals regularly with their parents perform better academically. They're more likely to be on the honor roll, to make all A's, to do better in class. There's a lower risk of substance abuse. There's a lower risk of depression. There's a lower risk of teenage pregnancy. There's a lower likelihood of developing any sort of eating disorders. And for preschoolers, sitting around the kitchen table and eating supper with your family actually increases vocabulary. And that's something that, this initiative said, but that's something I even learned when I was going to school to become a speech pathologist. Anytime that the family's together and talking and sharing stories of their day and, teaching skills like asking to someone to pass something down to the table, learning what all the different foods are, that really increases vocabulary, it builds language skills, and it really helps little kids develop. Now, for the adult side of things, just like the kids, there's lower risk of depression for adults that regularly eat around the table with their families, increased self-esteem, healthier eating patterns because there's less fast food when you take the time to prepare a meal at home, and because there's healthier eating patterns, and this is my favorite benefit, less dieting involved. You don't have to diet anymore if you're not eating as much fast food or junk food. And I don't think there's any of us here that really enjoy dieting. At least I don't. But the Bible echoes all this research of the importance of the table. There's several functions the table represents in the Bible. And the first is the place of provision. So when we think, when we want to go eat, the table is what provides the food. Psalm 23, verse 5 is part of the 23rd Psalm that all of us probably know by heart. It says, "Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil, my cup runneth over." So even David, when he's writing this psalm and he's talking about God being a provider, he uses the imagery of the table. And he says that the enemy cannot take away what God has prepared for you at his table. And better yet, the enemy has to sit back and watch you enjoy what you're eating at the table because it's something he's lost and can never get back, and that's a relationship with God. So it's kind of like, I kind of think of it like, have you ever had to, if you are on a diet or if you're fasting for church, have you ever been in a situation where someone that you're with is not dieting or fasting and you've got to sit there and watch them eat all that good food and you can't have a piece of it? I've been there before. I went to the doctor, I think it was in February or March, and the doctor kind of listened to me, and they said, well, what I'm recommending for you is an anti-inflammatory diet, and you can't have any fried food, you can't have any sugar, you can't have any cheese, you can't have anything processed. All you can eat, and not even that much red meat, you need to eat grilled chicken and vegetables. That diet lasted all of about 2 weeks, and now I take supplements and deal with it. So the devil, I can't imagine if that's 2 weeks of me sitting back and watching everybody around me eat ice cream while I'm trying to hold out on the little bit of willpower I've got left. The devil's sitting there watching us enjoy that relationship with God, watching God provide for us, and even our enemy, as much as he hates us, God will not let him take away what God has prepared for us at his table. Another really great example of the table of provision in the presence of your enemies is the story of Joseph in Genesis. So just for a little bit of context, and I know this is a story a lot of us grew up hearing in Sunday school, Joseph was born into a very messy family. His father, Jacob, had 12 sons and at least one daughter with 2 wives and 2 concubines. And there's so much backstory we could talk about how he really loved Rachel, but he got tricked into marrying her older sister, Leah. And he didn't love her, but he loved Rachel. So he gets tricked into working for his uncle Laban for 7 more years. So he ends up working, these 14 years to be able to marry Rachel. And these sisters fight, and Rachel can't have kids, but Leah can. So they end up both giving their servants as concubines to Jacob so they can have more kids that they can claim. So it's all this rivalry and fighting. And finally, Rachel has a son and names him Joseph. And then she goes on to have another son and names him Benjamin before she passes away in childbirth. But this big dysfunctional family, if I had to guess, probably didn't get along well enough to eat meals together. And it definitely shows in the story. So Joseph is the son of Jacob's old age, the firstborn son of his favored wife. So obviously, Joseph is the favorite of the family. And to make matters worse, because all the older brothers, I'm sure, knew that Joseph was the favorite. To make matters worse, Jacob gives Joseph the famous coat of many colors. And then on top of all that, Joseph begins having these dreams that all of his brothers are going to bow down to him. So Joseph's brothers finally get enough of this, and they get mad enough to sell him into slavery in Egypt. So he goes, and he's a slave, and he works for a man named Potiphar, and he does really, really well to the point that Potiphar puts him in charge of the whole household, and then Potiphar's wife comes along and ruins it all, accuses him of a crime he didn't commit, and Joseph is put in prison. But this whole time, what looked like such a messy story, God was actually positioning Joseph to be exactly where he needed to be. And that's kind of something that we talked about in our Women of the Word Bible study here lately. You know, just a little bit of a side note away from the table for a minute. Even when life doesn't make sense, when we're in situations where this isn't fair, this hurts, I don't know what's going on, and it gets really, really hard to trust when you can't see, just know that even in the middle of all of that mess, God is putting you exactly where you need to be to do things that nobody else might be able to do but you. To be able to reach people that maybe nobody else might be able to reach. But through your testimony, through where you're at, through your trial, God's going to use you. So anyways, Joseph's in the prison, and Pharaoh has a dream one night. And he can't understand what these dreams mean. And the cupbearer, who Joseph had actually interpreted a dream for, says, well, I know a guy that can do this for you. So they called Joseph out of prison, and he interprets Pharaoh's dreams and said, well, these dreams that you're having mean that there's going to be 7 years of plenty. We're going to have so much crops coming in that we're going to have to build storehouses to put them all in. But then, after that 7 years of plenty, it's going to be 7 years of severe famine, the likes of which we've never seen before. So Joseph, because he was able to interpret these dreams through the power of God, is promoted to second in command over all of Egypt. And God used Joseph to save the world from famine. And that's what one of the things, again, kind of stepping back from the theme of the table, if everybody had finally figured out, oh, well, you're not really supposed to be in prison. We know you didn't commit that. If I was Joseph, I probably would have went home, and then the whole nation of Israel probably would have died in a famine. But because Joseph continued trusting God through that hardship, he was there to be able to save the known world at the time. So the famine finally hits after the 7 years of plenty is over, and the Bible says that people are coming from all over to Egypt to be able to buy grain to feed their starving families. And this actually includes Joseph's brothers. Now, this is the perfect opportunity, if Joseph really wanted to take revenge on his brothers. These guys are the people that started all this. They sold him into slavery. Their hatred put him through at least 13 years of imprisonment and slavery. But what was Joseph's response? Genesis 44 verse 16 says, when Joseph saw Benjamin, his full brother, with them, the half-brothers, he said to the steward of the house, take these men to my house, slaughter an animal, and prepare a meal. They are to eat with me at noon. I've read that some Bible scholars consider Joseph to be the closest parallel of Jesus found in the Old Testament. His brothers were horrible to him. Joseph was a second command over all of Egypt. Pharaoh had actually told him that nobody would lift a hand or foot in all of Egypt without Joseph's permission. He had the power to put these guys away for life. But instead of that, he responds by giving his starving brothers a meal in his very own house around his table. This is just like God meets us with grace at his table. Joseph sat down in the presence of his enemies that day. And just like that, even the presence of enemies who have repeatedly hurt us can never stop God from providing for us. When God gives us grace, just like we see in Joseph, our response should be to give grace to others, even our enemies. And we find that provision of grace and forgiveness around the table. The table is also the place where God shows us his love. Tables are still pretty common in developing relationships. Almost all dates that you hear about involve a stop at some sort of restaurant. It's kind of funny, if you ever really watch somebody that's just dating, you can kind of gauge the seriousness of the relationship by how nice the restaurant is. If it's a first date, you might go out and eat at Mi Pueblo or maybe Casa Ley, but by the time they get really serious, they're going to eat supper at a steakhouse or going to make reservations at a seafood place. So the table kind of is central to the building of relationships. Whenever people want to get to know each other better, even in non-romantic relationships, a really common place to meet is around the table. But Song of Solomon, chapter 2, verse 4, says, "He brought me to the banqueting house. His banner over me was love." The entire book of Song of Solomon compares the love between God and his church to the love between a groom and a bride. Just like, a man that's wanting to win a woman over to be his wife, he'll take her somewhere nice to eat, or if like my husband, he'll fix her something nice to eat. God's table is a place where he demonstrates his love to us. Psalm 34 verse 8 says, "O taste and see that the Lord is good. Blessed is the man that trusteth in him." Because of God's love for us, we have security around his table. To further this a little bit, Lamentations says in chapter 3 and verse 22, "Because of the Lord's great love for us, we are not consumed, for his compassions never fail." The table is also a place of communion and covenant. Now, most Pentecostal churches don't have one, but we went to Braden's church that he grew up in. He grew up Church of Christ, and we went there for last Mother's Day. And around their table, they actually have, or around their altar, I should say, they have got a table that they serve communion on. It's called the Lord's Table, and it'll say something like, "Do this in remembrance of me." You might see this. Some Pentecostal churches have it. I've seen pictures and live streams, but you'll find it a lot in other denominations. But that table is a place of communion and covenant with God. Covenant meals were actually pretty common back in the Old Testament. The first covenant meal described in the Bible was between God himself, Moses, and the elders of Israel. In Exodus chapter 24, starting at verse number 9, it kind of describes this. God's meeting with Moses on Mount Sinai, and he calls up Moses and some of the other elders of Israel, and this is what happened. It says, "Moses and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and the 70 elders of Israel went up and saw the God of Israel. Under his feet was something like pavement made of lapis lazuli, as bright blue as the sky. But God did not raise his hand against these leaders of the Israelites. They saw God, and they ate and drank." Now, back in the Old Testament, it was taught that if any man was to ever see God, he would die. And God himself even says that when Moses says, "Show me your glory," God would not reveal his whole figure to Moses lest he die. But it says here, they saw God, and instead of getting mad that these leaders of Israel saw God, God sat down and ate a covenant meal with them. They'd been given the law. They've been taught and instructed how to serve God when they went to the promised land, and to tie it all up in a nice bow. God sat down and ate and drank a meal with them. This pattern continues in the tabernacle. Whenever Moses is describing the instructions that God gave him for all the furniture, with the table of showbread. And this is in the very next chapter after they eat this covenant meal. So Exodus chapter 22, and starting at verse 23 says, "Make a table of acacia wood, 2 cubits long, a cubit wide, a cubit and a half high. Overlay it with pure gold, and make a gold molding around it. Also make it a rim of a handbreadth wide, and put a gold molding on the rim. Make 4 gold rings for the table, and fasten them to the 4 corners where the 4 legs are. The rings are to be close to the rim and hold the poles used in carrying the table. Make the poles of acacia wood, overlay them with gold, and carry the table with them. And make its plates and dishes of pure gold, as well as its pitchers and bowls for the pouring out of offerings. Put the bread of the presence on this table to be before me at all times." So, we've heard about showbread. It was the unleavened bread. There was 12 pieces, representing one for every tribe of Israel. And even though it's called showbread a lot, here it's referred to as the bread of the presence. These priests were supposed to eat the bread after it had been displayed in God's presence, and it was supposed to be a lasting symbol of covenant between God and his people. I also found it really interesting that in all these descriptions of what the table of showbread was supposed to look like, it was portable. It had rings where there were supposed to be poles where you could pick it up and carry it. So this table went wherever the Israelites went. Wherever God led them, God also met them at the table in the tabernacle to eat this meal of showbread with the priest. And then, skipping way ahead to the New Testament, the new covenant was made between Jesus and his disciples around the supper table. And that's a story that we all call the Last Supper. And that's described in Matthew chapter 26. I'm going to start in verse 20. "When evening came, Jesus was reclining at the table with the 12. And then skipping down to verse 26, while they were eating, Jesus took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and gave it to his disciples, saying, "Take and eat, this is my body." And then he took a cup, and when he had given thanks, he said to them, saying, "Drink from it, all of you. This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins." So when Jesus wanted to make a covenant, and it's one that we're still under today, he invited his disciples around the table. And he knew that they were about to fail him. He knew that Judas was going to betray him. He knew that Peter was going to deny him 3 times. And the rest of the disciples would scatter after Jesus was arrested for fear that they also would be arrested and crucified. But he still wanted a relationship with them, and he formed that around the table. The table's also a place of celebration. So kind of like, I talked about in the opening of the lesson, what's the first thing that people want to do when they achieve something? If you've got a student that graduates, or a promotion, or anything good that happens, we celebrate by eating. And like I said, with our family, we all went out to eat. With Braden's family, they cook. And we see this with weddings. We serve meals at wedding receptions. Now, not to embarrass my mom any, but when Braden and I were planning our wedding, my mom kept saying, well, back when me and your dad got married, we had cake, punch, maybe a bowl of mixed nuts and mints, and that's all you got. We didn't have these full meals. We didn't have to pay caterers to come in and serve a 5-course meal. You got what you got, and everybody was happy with it. But now you go and it's the big meals that everybody serves. But this kind of reflects back to ancient Israel. Wedding feasts were very common practice. The dancing and feasting would actually go on for 7 full days. Imagine paying that catering bill for 7 full days of feasting. And Jesus even acknowledges this in a parable. It's the parable of the wedding feast told in Matthew chapter 22. Jesus spoke to them again in parables, saying, "The kingdom of heaven is like a king who prepared a wedding banquet for his son. He sent his servants to those who had been invited to the banquet to tell them to come, but they refused to come. Then he sent more servants and said, 'Tell those who have been invited that I have prepared my dinner. My oxen and fattened cattle have been butchered, and everything is ready. Come to the wedding banquet.' But they paid no attention and went off, one to his field, another to his business. The rest seized the servants, mistreated them, and killed them. The king was enraged. He sent his army and destroyed those murderers and burned their city. Then he said to his servants, 'The wedding banquet is ready, but those I invited did not deserve to come. So go to the street corners and invite to the banquet anyone you can find.' So the servants went out into the streets and gathered all the people they could find, the bad as well as the good, and the wedding hall was filled with guests." So there's a place for everybody at God's table. Jesus paid the price for your sins and for mine at Calvary, and that's the ultimate reason we should all celebrate. But it's up to each and every one of us, like that parable says, whether or not we're going to accept that invitation to the wedding feast. And this is something that's also acknowledged in the book of Revelation, where John describes the wedding supper between Christ and his church at the very end of time. When all of this wraps up, we're all going to sit down at one big wedding feast in heaven. Revelation chapter 19 verse 7 says, "Let us rejoice and be glad and give him glory, for the wedding of the Lamb has come, and his bride has made herself ready." So, in conclusion, I'll leave you with a question. Are you hungry? The table's set. He wants to provide for you, build a relationship with you, and enter covenant with you, and spend all eternity celebrating around the supper table with you. Revelation chapter 3 verse 20 says, "Behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hear my voice and open the door, I will come into him and will sup with him and he with me." There's an old hymn, and we haven't sang it in a while, but I remember singing it growing up in the old church, "Come and dine." And it says, "Come and dine, the master calleth, come and dine. You may feast at Jesus' table all the time. He who fed the multitude turned the water into wine. To the hungry calleth now, come and dine." And that's God's invitation for us today. So as we transition into the worship service, I just invite all of you to prepare yourself. God's got a table set before us. Whenever we go into this worship service, I believe he's going to do great things. He wants to reach you. He wants to show you his love. He wants to draw you deeper. And even if you've been in church for longer than I've been alive, there's always room for you around the table. God always wants to give you more. So we'll have a short little break. We'll turn the lights down and start the music at 10:40, and we'll transition into worship service then. Thank y'all.